Hi, I'm Dr. David Dobson. Welcome to Conversations. Today, my guest is Dr. Martina Kopf. Martina is a senior lecturer in African literature at the Department of African Studies at the University of Vienna. Today, we will discuss her research on contemporary Kenyan literature. It's a pleasure to have you on my show, Martina.
Thank you so much for inviting me, David. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the privilege.
Martina, your teaching and research focuses on African literature. What brought your interest to African literature?
Well, I studied African studies, gender studies, and development studies in Vienna and in Naples in Italy in the 1990s. And actually, I first had enrolled in history and political science. And as a student, I found these disciplines terribly Eurocentric. I had traveled to Burkina Faso in West Africa after finishing high school, and I just wanted to learn more. So I enrolled in African studies, took language courses in Bamanankan and Hausa. I took courses in African history and African literature, and I liked reading novels. And in my studies, I started reading African novels. So I read novels from the canon of post-colonial African literature like Chinua Achebe, Buchi Emecheta, Flora Nwapa, many writers from Nigeria, from Cameroon, Mongo Betty, writers from Senegal, from Zimbabwe, and I enjoyed reading the stories. They gave me much to think.
Yeah.
They showed me perspectives on life, on history, on gender, on family life, on global relations, some of which I could relate to, some of which were completely new.
Mhm.
So I kept reading and I have not stopped ever since.
Ha, fascinating story. So, why is studying African literature important?
Let me first say that there is not one African literature. There are many. There
Mm,
is writing in African languages,
mm,
in Swahili, for instance, in
mm,
Yoruba, in Ndebele, in Hausa, in Gikuyu, in Amharic, and others. Unfortunately, African language literatures are often not translated. And
mm,
there is writing in English, in
mm,
French, in Portuguese, Arabic, and Spanish.
mm,
There is literature of the global African diaspora, which
mm,
comes in still more languages. And there is oral literature in all African languages. So, one thing about studying African literature is to acknowledge this plurality and these diverse traditions.
mm,
Having said this, I think there are many reasons for studying African literature. The Nigerian writer Chinua Achebe wrote an essay with the title The Truth of Fiction, to
mm,
which I often refer. In
mhm,
it, he makes an argument for fiction and art in general, and he writes that fiction offers people a second reality, a second handle on their existence. So literature provides a space to bring voices and experiences to the
mm,
fore, which are
mm,
often excluded or marginalized in
mm,
mainstream discourses about Africa. Voices of women, of so-called ordinary people, of
mm,
children.
mm,
So um, Wale Adebanwi, another scholar which not only I often refer to, he's a social science scholar. He
mm,
described the African writer and the writer in general as a social thinker. And I think this holds true for many of the novels and short stories
mm,
published by African and African
mm.
diaspora writers today. They portray social reality, but they also think them through and provide alternative insights.
You are reading several African literatures. Uh, do you find some similarities between this literature?
Yes, definitely. When we talk of African literature in English language, if we talk
Mm,
about modern African fiction, there are
mm,
similarities
mm,
by through there are similarities between Nigerian writers and Kenyan writers. For
mhm,
instance,
mhm,
women writers who there are many writers of the so-called first generation who started to write fiction after independence, who used writing to um, as a kind of archive of cultural traditions, of gender relations, also, and of communal knowledge and things like that. And there are similarities um, um, between many of these first generation writers, but there are also things that are specific to their national background. For instance, in Nigerian literature, it was a major issue was the Biafra War in the end of the 1960s, where a lot of writers dealt with and kind of tried to come to terms with in their writing, which was unique to Nigeria, but unfortunately, there have been other experiences of a warring conflict in other countries as well, which has often driven writers to use literature as a way to process these memories.
You mentioned one of the challenge with African literature was not enough translation available for several literature which African authors wrote. Do you think this is still a problem?
I think that those writers who for instance, who write in Swahili, they have local readerships, and if they or writers who write in Yoruba or in Hausa, they have often big local readerships. So for them, maybe it's not so much a problem in terms of finding an audience, but I think some of them maybe would like to be translated, and I also think that that global audiences lose something out.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah,
are
yeah,
losing something.
yeah. I'm just wondering, the literature you've been reading, the African literature you've been reading, the authors, who are these people?
Well, in my recent work, I've above all engaged in Kenyan literature and worked on Kenyan authors. Also met a few Kenyan writers, and I would say they are also from different walks of
Mm,
life.
mm,
So uh, the early writers of fiction, of novels of the 1960s, they were often academics or based in
mhm,
many of them based in the literature department at the University of Nairobi, such as, for instance, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who is probably the best known Kenyan writer. We had the pleasure to host him here in Vienna a few years ago, and he um, he he studied English. He started to write during his studies, and he also taught literature at the literature department in Nairobi. He was very he and others, they were very activist as well, committed into decolonizing literary studies at the time in Nairobi. But there are others also from the same generation, such as Rebecca Njau, for instance, who also started writing in the 1960s and publishing. And she had different. She worked as a teacher. She was founding school director. She ran she ran a gallery, an art gallery with her husband. She worked for the National Council of Kenyan Churches, and so she worked in very different
mhm,
um, realms. And um, in the if we take a step further, um, uh, in after the turn of the millennium, there was uh, uh, there was a literary initiative, a writers collective called Kwani,
Mm-hmm.
which was mainly started by people who returned from the
Mm,
diaspora, who had left Kenya in the 1990s,
mm,
and who returned after the democratic turn after the millennium, and they they were not necessarily so much based in academia.
mm,
They tried to open up literature in Kenya um, um, more to popular culture. They published a magazine, a literary magazine, where they also published graphic novels
mhm,
and experimented with different genres, and they very um, they wanted to distinguish themselves from academic
mm,
literary circles.
yeah, yeah. Your recent work is on contemporary Kenyan literature. Tell us
Mhm.
about your interest in contemporary literature.
Well, I think contemporary literature, I understand contemporary literature above all as a witness to contemporary issues.
Mm,
And I use the term also to distinguish contemporary modern literature, Kenyan literature, as it has emerged from the 1960s onwards,
mm,
to from older literary traditions in Kenya. It is important to mention it's
yeah.
Kenya is home to century-old literary traditions, both
Mm,
written and oral.
mm,
Uh, the city of Mombasa on the coast and the islands of Lamu and Pate, they were historically centers of Swahili trade and culture. And Swahili has a written literary tradition um, dating back at least to the 18th century, and it was part of a rich oral culture, meaning that most Swahili verbal art was composed and performed orally. And other ethnic groups as well, like the Gikuyu, the Kamba, the Luo, Maasai, or others, had their own oral cultures with their own creation myths, with songs, stories, proverbs, and historical traditions as well. And
mm,
all this was already there when modern fiction and drama emerged in post-independence Kenya. And in its origins, this modern literature or contemporary literature was a literature of decolonization.
mm,
So until a few years ago, it was mainly written in English.
mm,
Today, there are also more and more authors writing and
mm,
publishing in Swahili or
mm,
also in Gikuyu.
mm,
So it was the colonial schools who created literature and art in Kenya as a blank space. And in schools, the principal language of instruction was English, and the curricula were based on the British
mm,
school curriculum. So students were taught the canon of British and European literature, and they were educated in the understanding that their ancestors had no literature. And
mm,
in independent Kenya, writing became a space to reappropriate one's own history, to
mm,
counter colonial myths and single narratives,
mm,
and also to reflect on the enormous social and cultural changes.
mm. Yeah. You brought very interesting and very important point, the oral tradition. I mean, the
Mhm,
many culture, and you mentioned in Africa and Kenya, they have the oral tradition, and so a lot of stories and a lot of um, culture goes through oral tradition, like passing from generation to generation.
mhm.
How important is to preserve or maintain that oral tradition and the sharing of the knowledge through orally?
I think Kenyan scholars would maybe
Yeah.
be able to answer this better than me.
Hmm.
uh, but Kenya has early on, they engaged in researching oral cultures in the country, and they made it part of their literature curriculum at the University of Nairobi. And there is also a very active association for oral literature in Kenya, and there are also students, academics who also today who research oral cultures, and for instance, in relation to ecological knowledge, in relation to understandings of humanism, of humanity and things like that. And oral culture is also transforming. And many writers, many fiction writers or writers of modern fiction, they have integrated elements of the languages, of their tales, and of oral culture into their novels.
Nice. In one of your recent projects, you investigated the concept of development in post-colonial Kenyan writing. Can you share a little bit about this project with us?
Yes, sure. Maybe let me first talk here a bit about development. Why development?
Okay.
So in the project, I engaged with Kenyan literature as a site of development theory and development critique. And my main aim was to bring African literature and development studies into dialogue. It came out of an interest into the field of international development and humanitarianism, which came from because I after my completing my PhD, I worked for an Austrian NGO, and I was also teaching courses in development studies. And I thought so many things African literature would be such an important source of knowledge in development studies. It's not only me who thinks that, but it's something I engaged in. So why development? Development has become such a central concept in the 20th century. Its countries were categorized as developed, as underdeveloped, or developing. Standards were created and asserted to measure development and compare it. And if we look back in history, it was European, later Soviet and US imperialism which were crucial to this. It was mainly them who legitimized their conquest and their global leadership by defining themselves as developed and claiming to help less developed nations to develop. So this is something we know. But also development has become such an important concept in the name of which politics is made. There is no consensus on what development actually is. And if you ask people in Austria what development is, they won't give you a clear answer. But if you ask them what they think about development in Africa, they will think primarily of development aid, and that development is about helping the poor. So they will mostly consider development itself to be a good thing. If you ask people in Kenya, many will associate not only positive experiences with development. Development in Nairobi can mean that neighborhoods are gentrified, that people living and working in so-called informal settlements as artisans and traders are being evicted, that their shops and stalls are raided by city authorities in the name of urban development. And this, for instance, is something that writer Major Mwangi presented in a very pointed way in his novel Going Down River Road, a novel which was written and published in the 1970s, which is and it is a classic of Kenyan literature. And it is about construction workers in Nairobi who are building a large building called Development House in the novel. And none of the construction workers really knows what will be there. They only know that once the building is finished, they will not be allowed to set foot in it. So while they are building the development house, the shacks in which they live and the street stalls where they eat are being closed down by the health police. So this is one novel that gives an insight how on negative sides of how development was and continues to be experienced. Another case is that development in Kenya can mean that foreign NGOs and their staff drive up prices for housing and services. Or as in the 1980s and 1990s, that the International Monetary Fund imposed structural adjustment programs on the government that led to education and health no longer being subsidized. And this period of structural adjustment and the consequent NGOization of the social sector, this is something that was repeatedly brought up by another much acclaimed Kenyan writer, the late Binyavanga Wainaina, who was also one of the founders of this writers collective, Kwani, which I talked before. And he portrayed these negative effects of development in his satirical essays, in his short stories, and in his memory, in his memoir, One Day I Will Write About This Place. So in the project, I read novels and short stories as a source of knowledge in the context of wider debates on development in Kenya and Africa. And I approached them as a critique of existing development practices and paradigms, but I also read them as sources of alternative knowledge, in the sense of that novels, that fiction and autobiographies, that we can learn from them what well-being and a good life means to people in Kenya, by what means they try to create a good life for themselves, for their families and communities, and what prevents them from doing that.
Yeah, for sure. Your recent research is on Kenyan diaspora in literature and popular culture. Why was the study of the Kenyan diaspora important?
Well, it came out when we talk about Kenyan literature, we also need to talk about the Kenyan diaspora, because many writers have at one time or another been part of African diaspora communities, either in other African countries or abroad. As I said before, I think Ngugi wa Thiong'o, for instance, he had to leave Kenya in the early 1980s when his life was no longer safe in Kenya. And he has made a new home in California, but from there he has remained an active and committed voice in Kenyan literature. Or the same holds true for the late Michere Mugo, who was a great poet, a literary scholar, a feminist activist, who also had to leave her country in the 1980s. So Kenyans have left the country and continue to leave for various reasons, not all of them political. And Nairobi's literary culture today would not be the same if not for these exchanges with people from the diaspora, either returning or continuing writing and producing abroad or in other countries. So together with colleagues from Swahili Studies and with a colleague from Moi University in Eldoret in West Kenya, we organized a workshop to explore these relations between home and abroad. not only in literature, but also in popular culture, in theater. And out of this, we co-edited a special issue on Kenyans abroad that we published with the Journal of Eastern African Literary and Cultural Studies. And
Mm,
the subtitle, Cultures of Unhoming, in brackets, in a Contemporary World, this
mm,
was inspired by a book by Nanshala Nyabola, who is a Kenyan lawyer and human rights activist and writer. And it was inspired by an essay in this volume with the title The African is Not at Home.
mm, wonderful. Uh, you also give lectures and seminars on African literary studies.
Mm.
Uh, Please share a little bit about your teaching activities.
Yeah, I teach courses in literary
Mm,
history with focus on East and West Africa.
mm,
I teach contemporary writers, also mostly from East and West Africa. Um, I regularly teach courses on African feminism and gender studies in
mm,
Africa, and also in development. And I also teach general introductions into African literature for first-year students. And in the introductory courses, in particular, it's my aim, next to
mm,
providing an overview
mm,
into
mm,
an overview of writers,
mm,
issue critical debates in African literary studies. It's
mm,
always my aim to engage students in creative genres.
mm. Does your teaching also involve field trip, traveling these countries and experiencing firsthand?
It does. It's different from social sciences, so I'm not a field researcher in this sense, but it's well, for the project I talked before, I did field research in Nairobi
Mm,
in 2018 and 2020,
mm,
where uh, I I um, had interviews but I attended literary events.
mm,
For instance, one I particularly remember, it was the book launch of Nairobi Noir. It's an anthology which appeared in 2020. And this it was really a great event that brought 16, I think, writers together in Nairobi, and it was a full auditorium, so it was really
mm,
a wonderful event. It's also one can also find the discussions on YouTube. They were recorded.
mm,
I also did interviews. I had the privilege to meet Rebecca Njau when I was there, um, and uh, I presented my work at the University of Nairobi, at Kenyatta University,
mm,
and at Moi University as well. So I'm trying, and it's always when I go to conferences
mm,
in um, Kenya, or uh, it's I always return um, with a lot of new insights.
mm.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. What is your advice for students who wish to study African literature?
Well, my first advice is read novels. So read, engage with creative genres, check out and attend literary events, readings, poetry slams. They are fun, and listening to other people's stories will make you a richer person.
Mm,
If you want to learn more about African literature, check out online literary platforms and
mm,
blogs.
mm,
I'd recommend Brittle Paper and the blog Writing Africa.
mm,
If you look for inspiration to read, what to read, go to Brittle Paper and
mm,
check their list 100 notable African books 2024.
mhm,
And there are also excellent online literary journals where you can read African short stories, for instance, Lolwe or Isele magazine.
mm,
There are also reading circles on social media as well, reading circles that meet and discuss African novels. And if you want to study African literature at university level, there are BA and MA programs in African studies programs,
mm,
for instance,
mhm,
in Austria and Germany, which is
mm,
where I am based. There are study programs in African literature at our university, at the University of Vienna, at Humboldt University in Berlin, at the University of Bayreuth, and there is a new MA program in African literatures and cultures at the University of Tübingen,
mm,
and also quite a few English, French, and comparative literatures departments also offer courses that focus on African and African diaspora writers,
mm,
often under the umbrella um, of postcolonial studies. And if your university does not offer any opportunity to study African literature, then I would say demand for it.
very good. Yes, for sure. Yeah. Martina, what is next for you?
Well, I'm working on compiling my research on Kenyan literature into a book.
Mm,
I'm also continuing on my work on intercultural feminist studies. We have recently published a special issue on current trends, uncommon paths, decolonizing academia through feminism. That's the title.
mm,
And in this special issue, we have assembled feminist scholars and poets, women and men from
mm,
Nigeria, from Kenya, from
mhm,
Germany and Austria, to engage decolonial feminism as a path towards a more inclusive university. And this special issue is published open access on the website of Stichproben, Vienna
mhm,
Journal of African Studies. Feel free to read. And for further project, funding is an issue. So
mm,
my plans for further projects depend on whether I will be able to acquire funding for them.
mm. Thank you for your time, Martina, and best wishes on the work you do.
Thank you, David. Thank you for hosting me. Thank you for the conversation.